So this is the priority theme again on democracy, conflict, and polarization. And one of the main activities that we'll be launching this year is this series of seminars that really spotlights not only the research and outcomes of the work that our members do, but also how we do our work, because the way that EGAP members often work is unique, I think, across both implementing partners and researchers, and that we form partnerships between those two groups to allow us to leverage the good work that's being done by policymakers and practitioners, and then the expertise of researchers to study how interventions might be improved, or whether interventions are actually working in the world. So these seminars not only are going to convey the findings of these interesting projects, but also how the sausage is made, how these partnerships form, what works, what doesn't. Most of these are successful versions of these partnerships. So those of us entering into such partnerships in the future might learn from them what to do and maybe what not to do. So we have a series of these for each priority theme. Another of ours will be in February, so stay tuned. Those of you who are here today will get invitations to the subsequent seminars. A couple of logistics. We welcome your questions both during the present, or it's not really a presentation, but during the conversation, as well as we'll try and make time for explicit Q&A at the end. And if you have questions that don't get answered in the course of this hour, we have a seminar page on the EGAP website, and you should feel free to leave questions and comments there, and our panelists will work to answer those after the fact. This is being recorded, and if you miss it or have to leave early, we're going to make it available online. You can also share it with colleagues. All right, so let's get started. I am going to moderate this, and I'll be asking, because the goal of this is really to learn from both sides of the equation, from the practitioner side and the researcher side. I'll be asking questions to both at the same time, so we get to hear both perspectives. And as we go through, we'll learn about, I know there wasn't any information sent ahead of time in terms of a paper, so you're not expected to have read anything. So you'll learn about the nature of the project and the findings sort of as we go. But if you're missing any key pieces of information that would be helpful to understand, please raise your hand or jump in the chat. The title of the project that we'll be learning about today, oops, sorry, I just lost my file. There we go, is Political Polarization and Municipal Government Accountability During the COVID-19 Pandemic in Mexico. So I'll quickly introduce our speakers here. We've got on the research side, Jose Ramon Enriquez, who's a student in political economy and government at Harvard. Alberto Simser, who's a professor of political science at ITAM, and Horacio Lergi, who just joined Alberto Simser at ITAM as an associate professor of economics and political science. And I think John Marshall is not here with us today, but he is an assistant professor of political science at Columbia University. And then on
here.
Oh, he is here. Hi. Sorry, I didn't see you. Glad to have all four of this fantastic team together today. And then finally, we have on the implementer side, Monica Meltis is the executive director of Data Civica. She studied political science and international relations at ITAM. And Data Civica is a nonpartisan civil society organization in Mexico that uses information communication technology to help protect human rights and empower citizens. And important to this study, they have experience in developing web-based platforms to provide political information to the public. And we'll hear more from Monica herself about the kind of work that they've been doing and did do in this for the study. So while the findings are in and of themselves really fascinating, as I mentioned, we're gonna learn about how these two partners came together and how they work together to implement this intervention research. And in addition, I'd like you to stay tuned till the end to have a kind of meta conversation that came up. This topic came up in early conversations that I had with Monica and the team about the nature of even doing interventions or research in a polarized setting. So we'll get to that at the end, but Monica was talking about just how it's difficult for some CSOs or some NGOs in polarized or conflict settings to even do their work, and for researchers to even start asking some of these politically charged or difficult questions. And thus the nature of what we're even able to learn in such a setting could be biased or incomplete because of those difficulties and those inequalities across types of groups that even are able to work with researchers. So I thought that was a really critical point, and one that EGAP as an organization should be thinking about. So I'm going to save that till the end, but I'd like to address that with this group today if we have time. Okay, so enough from me. Let's hear from our panelists. So the first topic, or the first question I wanted to ask to all of you is how we should think about addressing the problem of democratic accountability in the face of a crisis. So for the researchers, a lot is already known about accountability, and many of you or all of you have done work on this before, often in this exact setting on democratic accountability. But this is largely studied under normal times, or whatever, non-COVID crisis times. So how do you expect what we know about accountability in those times to translate to crisis time, this particular crisis time, and vice versa? Do you expect lessons from this project to then only apply during future crises, or more generally? And one thing that came to mind that might be different about this particular moment is how what the reference point is for citizens when they're thinking about their politicians. So often we think that citizens are evaluating their politician relative to some benchmark or relative to some other politician out there, either the opposition or the incumbent's own history. But here in this crisis time, we really see how other countries are handling the crisis. And with COVID, most leaders were not doing so well handling the crisis. So I wonder if that makes it even harder to elicit accountability around COVID policies, because citizens might just say, well, even much more developed countries than ours can't deal with this very well. So is that an extra challenge to accountability? And then for Monica as well, what piqued your interest in this question of accountability during COVID in particular? Was it something that was challenging to you in as much as you were already doing work on this topic? And did the researchers' questions, when they I don't know if they came to you or you came to them, but did these questions align with ones that you had been asking? So maybe we can hear from the researchers first, and then Monica.
I'm happy to start. Well, I think there are two things. On the one hand, and these are maybe two arguments that go in opposite directions. On the one hand, when you have a time of crisis in terms of health or life-threatening disasters, like a famine or floods or things like that, you would expect democratic accountability to become to function at that time, if it is ever going to function, right? And in fact, some people have argued and shown in some work that in times of crisis, democracy with respect to non-democracy is protective of citizens. And Amartya Sen famously argued that there are no famines in democracies, but there are other examples. There's other work too. On the other hand, like you were saying, Jessica, I think that's correct. The fact that citizens don't experience those crises so often means that they're a little bit at a loss as to how to judge, how to benchmark performance, and incumbents are able to get away with arguments of the sort of, well, who could have foreseen this, or we're doing what we can. And it's very difficult to judge what could have been, because people are not epidemiologists. Even epidemiologists have a hard time, right? So I think those two things are true at the same time, and which one is more important, I think is a toss-up. But of course, we have evidence from our study. But I will leave it at that.
Well, thank you for having us, and thank you, Jessica, for being part of this great initiative at EGAP. I think it's really amazing to have this kind of seminars. I would start telling you about a little bit of the context in Mexico. So what we saw in the beginning of the pandemic was that a lot of municipal governments started to create this very decentralized response to COVID. And this might be generalizable to other developing countries and especially to other federations where you have local governments that have relatively strong jurisdiction and abilities to implement public responses. So what we saw was that in some way, these municipal governments were trying to fill a void that was there, because there was this lack of response from either state governments or federal governments. And this was, to me, and this is reading a lot of media outlets and also watching all this videos of mayors, of hundreds of mayors across the country, was that they felt that at some point voters will hold them accountable in the future. And the idea is that at some point voters will look at them and they will judge them in terms of the amount of effort they were able to put and the amount of resources that they were able to cater to the voters as well. So I think this is, in times of crisis, you can see that. And I take your point, Jessica, that we are able to benchmark what is the kind of effort that you are executing in a particular area or jurisdiction. And this may come easier during times of crisis because you can see what the neighbor is doing or what the neighbor is not doing. And you can also observe other kind of responses, maybe more creative as well. But I also think that in times of that we can learn some things of that we can apply for times of normal times, I would say. So during crisis, we will be able to see more clearly what's the effort that politicians are making and maybe the type of politicians that every jurisdiction and municipality has as an incumbent.
Yeah, and you raised something important that's about your study that's worth pointing out, which is the level at which these politicians are operating. It's at a municipality level. So I think in that case, it's easier for people to have a group that they can compare their executive to. It would be much harder if you're looking at a national politician and then it's unclear, who should be the reference there. Monica, do you want to speak to this question?
I would just like to complement from our perspective, like being in field, in the field, I don't know, because we're actually not an NGO that we are like in the front line, So we are an NGO, a very particular NGO in Mexico City that work using technology and data analysis. These are some tools that are not usually implemented for many NGOs that work in defending human rights. So having said that, I think that one of the things that we've been looking at during the pandemic from our perspective and talking to other NGOs as well is that we need more tools to understand how accountability works during this time, of course. But there is a very particular context, as Jose Ramon was saying, and I would like to add to that context that there is an increasing militarization in the country process. So a lot of enforced disappearances, a lot of electoral violence, particularly at a municipal level. And these are things that are added up to the pandemic and particularly fostering during the pandemic. And I think that they have several consequences in the way in which society think or implement accountability processes, I mean, of course, I think one of the important things of this project is that we're able to have a little bit more information about how these processes work. However, I think it is important to bear in mind that it is a very risky and dangerous context for different populations, no? Not in the same way, of course. However, at a municipality level, it is important, I think, to keep that in mind. And that, of course, has an effect in the ways in which we can make accountable different administrations, no? So, I mean, I would like to Alberto and Jose Ramon and Horacio to tell us a little bit more about the project, but I think that's one of the things I would like to add from the perspective that we are in the NGO. No?
Thanks, Monica. For those of us who know little about the context, is there a relationship between COVID and the electoral violence?
Who wants, Jose Ramon, do you want to speak to that?
So is there a relationship between COVID and electoral violence?
And the increase in electoral violence that Monica is talking about.
Right. So I think, I mean, we should analyze this more systematically, but we definitely think that this is an unprecedented time and put a lot of pressure on both incumbents and voters. So I would like to emphasize that this is a particular, given the polarization narrative that we have been listening to since 3 years ago in Mexico, and then in addition, the response of the federal government to COVID, I think it may only emphasize the critical times that we are measuring. And what we see is that every action by the federal government is taken by the opposition parties and the opposition politicians as something to be critical, to be subject of critic. And this is only, I think, putting a lot of more pressure on what type of actions are being taken off by incumbents both across all levels of government.
Thanks.
If I may add.
Oh, sure.
I think that the electoral violence precedes COVID, and it's very similar to what has been happening now. And so in that sense, I would say the answer is most probably no. The bulk of the violence has to do with other factors that have nothing to do with COVID. That would be my guess. But like Jose Ramon said, it's worth maybe investigating. Anyway, I forgot to say, to echo Jose Ramon's sentiment, that we're really glad for this opportunity and for the opportunity to get feedback and for the invitation. So, and this is a great forum for us for this work that we're conducting and that is still work in progress. So thank you everyone, and thank you, Jessica, for looking at our work and creating questions and providing comments. Now, I don't know how much the audience knows about what we did, or I don't know what the audience knows. But I'll leave it to you, Jessica, to tell us what you want us to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so we'll get into the nuts and bolts of what the intervention looked like in a second. But I had another preliminary question about even how you conceptualize the problem here. So they'll show you exactly what the intervention looked like in a minute. As I said, it's an information intervention where through Facebook, citizens are given information about their municipal elected officials, and then they're studying the effect of that information on subsequent voting behavior. And a couple of the arms of this intervention look pretty standard relative to existing work on on democratic accountability, where you provide information about either the state of the world that people might not know, or you provide information about the acts of the politician that they might not be aware of, and then you see what happens. But one really unique feature of this intervention is that the authors and with Data Civica decided to integrate an anti-polarization message into this work. And so my question is around that, is why now did you decide in this project? I know many of you have done accountability projects before in Mexico, and this hasn't really entered into your thinking. Why now are you trying to join these kinds of more traditional messages about information with this polarization message? Is this a new problem, or one that came out of seeing things not work before because this was an existing problem? So my question is around, why now this attempt to address head-on the problem of polarization in Mexico?
I think we had many discussions about this early on in the project when we were designing it and trying to refine the focus. And let me show you. So there's many ways. I think each of us came at this from a different place. For me, a really important thing was this juncture between the terrible state of affairs in Mexico. It has one of the highest case fatality rates in the world, and also one of the highest numbers of confirmed cases and deaths. And the popularity of the president. So this is February 2020, which I think was at the end of February was the first officially confirmed case. 62 approved, 33 disapprove, and this is today. 65 approved, barely any movement. So to me, that raised the question: why is that? And it's an inescapable fact of life if you live in Mexico today that things are highly polarized. Of course, the president himself makes an effort to depict the world in black and white. If you're not with us, you're against us, and that will sound familiar to many of you. But he makes a big effort every morning to discount the so-called conservatives, which is everybody who doesn't agree with him, or the establishment, the mafia in power. That's a phrase that he coined, the mafia del poder. So and also, I mean, just from anecdotal evidence, my social networks are more segregated than ever before. I don't have any partisan diversity in my social networks, which did not used to be the case in the past. So there's, I think, a distinct impression that polarization is, and of course the rhetoric between pro and anti-government, like Jose Ramon was saying, the rhetoric has heated up, and there's a lot of mistrust and a lot of belittling the other side and calling them names and dismissing them. And this is really polarization. And of course, if you want accountability, you want people to consider government effort and government outcomes, government actions, and to reward or punish accordingly. You don't want people to consider government identity as the sole benchmark of whether you support or don't support. That way of looking at the world completely undermines the logic of accountability. So I think it was a very good, it ended up being a very good choice on our part. Not all of us were equally convinced that this would work, but well, the results speak for themselves. Yeah.
Well, if I may, well, so I think that doing an information treatment during times of COVID is really, it's a big challenge, because this will imply that we are providing new information to people. And we saw that during more than 1 year, people were constantly consuming information on the number of cases, number of deaths. And you may think that this is not a new piece of information for voters. I think that was the first challenge for our project. So it was a way to frame this information as new information and have people learn about the state of affairs in their municipality. So I think that was the first challenge. And I think thinking about how people will consume this information during this particular time in 2021, where intermediate elections happen. So it was more than we have been, the current incumbent has been in power for 3 years so far. And this was the first test for him. And he went to the polls, and there was some doubts whether this popularity will be translated into votes at some point, because we, as Alberto was saying, we didn't see a lot of changes throughout this period, but we also saw that the response to the crisis was probably not the best. So we were wondering all about whether this will be translated into some kind of electoral backlash. And I think we had these two type of things on our minds, whether this was a new information for voters and how would they consume this information during this particular time where the federal government was put to the test.
Thanks. Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'll ask you in a minute to show the actual intervention, the information that you provided folks. And it seems like some is new. The fact that you are providing information about the politician relative to other politicians, that might not be something that somebody already had. But before that, Monica, can you just speak to the extent to which polarization has posed a problem to the work that you were already doing in this space?
I would like to say that a lot of people wrote to us saying that it was weird that we were posting this information. That the people that follow us were very worried that we were like trying to, even though it wasn't a very like controversial at all information.
Which part was weird?
Sorry?
Which part was weird?
So everyone was telling us in Facebook that our followers, the people that know our work, they were saying that why were we sharing this information, and that if we had any proofs of this, and that some of us told us that our pages were hacked by the opposition. No? So there is a lot of polarization, of course, and I mean, it is really interesting to see, and Jose Ramon and Alberto will present it in a bit, but it is very interesting to see the way, because Data Civic is an NGO that we try to work with statistics and science and just to, like, in a very robust way, no? So trying to give the information and being as robust with our work as we possibly can, and even though this information was true, there were facts, people were very, very worried that we were sharing this type of information, sort of like trying to I guess they were thinking that we were trying to push for one side or the other. No, so I would just like to add that, because it was interesting to see. I think this is one way we can learn about how polarized the opinion is in Mexico, and how people were seeing us as an NGO that was not getting involved in that process. And they started to, they thought our pages were hacked, no? So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. The challenge of remaining a neutral party in a polarized environment, even if the information is straightforward and balanced, the way that it's perceived may not always be that way. That's fascinating. Okay, last contextual question until we jump into the details of the design. I think it's important to understand this before then. It is this question that Natalia Bueno posted in the chat, which is, what does polarization even mean in the Mexico context? You know, in the US, we think about left-right polarization or polarization across the Democratic and Republican Party. But what is the pole around which there is a cleavage in Mexico? Can you speak to that?
I can say my viewpoint, and I think Natalia makes a very good point about the fact that partisan attachments are not as strong as they are in the United States. But then the United States is really an outlier when you look at it in comparative perspective. Even in developed countries, do not tend to be as strong as in the United States. But and also the party in power right now is a new party, is a very new party, and many people were saying, well, this is not really a party, it's just the president who created the party. And I have my doubts. They have done a lot of institution building. They won everywhere in the country in 2018, everywhere, municipalities, states, everything, all over the country. And I think they will have staying power. So I think the main axis of polarization is pro versus anti Morena, which is the party. But right now the limelight is taken by the president, AMLO. That's the way people call him. And pro versus anti-Morena or AMLO is indistinguishable right now. And I think that is the axis. I agree with Horacio's comment.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now let's turn to the actual details of the design, what you did, what you were trying, what questions or hypotheses you were trying to test. And I think it's probably good at this point to bring up some slides that where we'll actually be able to see the information that you were providing in these Facebook messages. But as you go through, just a couple of questions I had is one, the first intervention that you have is about COVID cases and where your municipality falls relative to other municipalities. So it's a benchmarked sort of information. Whereas the second one is what your municipality leader, the mayor, did during COVID times to address the problem. And that one is not benchmarked. It's just here are some different policies that your leader took. So one question is, why is that not benchmarked? What did you think about that? And then the last question is about your anti-polarization message. So I think there's a lot less research or evidence around how to depolarize people. You know, Rob and I have been working on projects that try and think about this, but it's quite, I think because it's a relatively new problem and there's been relatively little research, I was wondering how you came up with the specific message that you did for your anti-polarization message, and whether there were others that you thought about. What was the kind of theoretical basis of that one that you chose?
Okay, I can start with the first part. So the first part is about benchmark information and how we communicate that information. And maybe Alberto, if you can show us the next slide. I think we have that in the next slide. So this is a particular case for Michoacán and Zacatecas, two of the states that we were looking at. So here we are showing the number of cases in the left and the number of deaths in the right. So we use two different colors to show where by quartile we show the number of cases and number of deaths. The idea was to show the people where their municipality lied in the distribution of cases and deaths in their own state. Here we selected a map of the states because there were some policies at the state level, and we thought that this was the most clean we could get. But also, since people were exposed to a lot of information, and maybe just hearing that there were 20 new COVID cases in your municipality would not tell you much. We decided to have these measures in per capita first, and then to have this distribution across the state. So I think we also selected the visual matter, the visual way to communicate this information, because I think it's much easier for people just to compare first to the neighboring municipalities and then to other places that might be hotspots in their own states. Regarding policies, we had a really long discussion about this, because in principle, there is no clear way to think about policies, because some people may prefer certain policies. So in general, you may think that people may be happy with more with policies that may take care of public health in general, but then you may have certain groups, let's say business owners, that are not very happy with business closures or closure of public spaces, obviously because they will have some impact on their businesses. So I think it is a big challenge on how to communicate this these policies, and we try to be as neutral as possible. And you may think that there might be certain intensities where you may think that certain policies were more stringent in certain municipalities and not in so others. So we decided, and just for simplicity, to just state the number and type of policies that a certain municipality was exposed to. And this was to avoid further discussion on whether certain policies were more strict or less strict, and whether these were viewed as by voters as positive or negative. So I think our new challenge is to see whether certain type of policies were more receptive by certain type of people based on their demographics. But in general, we were thinking of trying to benchmark first the cases and that's, and then just saying and communicating what type of policies they were implemented.
Let me add something to what Jose Ramon said. If you go back to a basic accountability model, you want to be able to measure either effort or ability of the incumbent, and we wanted to measure, but it's very difficult in practice, right? So the fact that one place has more cases doesn't necessarily mean that the incumbent was less competent, and that's a big issue. We thought then what we're going to do is also say what policies were implemented and how intensely they were implemented, meaning how well they were enforced and for how long. And of course, that's pie in the sky. The information to do that was not available. And so we were not able to do that. We had partial information on those dimensions, and we decided it's better not to give that information. This was one of the issues where we had a back and forth with Data Civica, and it was very helpful because they insisted, and rightly so, on having things that could be verified very clearly, right? And when you start interpreting information or selectively showing information for some places and not for others, you open yourself to charges of bias, right? And I think rightly so, we didn't want to do that. So I think showing the types of policies that were implemented is also is on the part of what that does is give additional information to try to make the signal a little stronger about effort. That's part of the role of the policies. There are other issues, but I think that's the main thing.
Great, thank you. And will one of you show the slide of the anti-polarization message, and will one of you speak to your thinking behind that language?
Sure. Let me try to. So here's the anti-polarization slide. Let me translate it. Not everybody, so everybody got this. This was the second slide. So basically the treatment consisted in a video that lasted about 30 seconds and had a few slides, and everybody got the benchmarked information about the number of COVID cases and COVID deaths in your municipality versus others in the state. We basically told people, are you in the top tercile, the middle tercile, or the lower tercile? Everybody got that information. Before that, we had this slide where Data Civica, where we wanted to say, you know, and Data Civica thinks about data as a tool for accountability. And then it says here, you know, the data we're going to show you reflecting part the decisions of the municipal government of this municipality. These things were shown to everybody. But then we randomized whether we showed this thing in the circle, which says, please consider the following information without letting yourself be carried by your emotions or your partisan preferences. So that's what we said. This is what we call the anti-polarization prompt. There is research that shows that prompts of this sort can actually nudge people to pay more attention or to absorb the information better that follows. There's also the issue of, and then, you know, of course, there's several issues. One is about the trustworthiness of the source, right? And on this slide, we were trying to buttress the trustworthiness of the source. So the fact that this information, that this prompt is here, may have had an effect along those lines. And then there's the trustworthiness of the information to come, which is, of course, directly related to the trustworthiness of the source. Now, how do we come to it? Well, yes, there is a little theory to go on, but I think that there's we have read some of the literature on collectively, probably a lot of literature, motivated reasoning and prompting in bias in psychology. And so this was a compromise between, well, there were many more things that we could have done. We could have done this in a more lengthy manner, but we wanted for this to be easily digestible in a short period of time. And we thought that these were the main factors, emotions and partisan preferences that make people unreceptive to information that doesn't suit them. So I mean, I don't know if anybody would like to jump in and add something, Horacio or John, on this very question.
Just a small thing. I mean, sort of, it's like just reinforcing what Alberto said. The key thing is to get people then to actually believe the source. We don't just say like the source is credible. And this is whole like more theoretical literature on double patient updating. Essentially, it's like whether first you update about the source, and then depending on your or what you think about the source, then you decide what to do. Essentially, what we really want you to get is to be for people to actually believe the source and really like this is why this particular the ordering of information sort of it's a somewhat subtle but very well thought in terms of where things should go and sort of, and for example, we don't think that the reverse potentially should work. But yeah, just yeah.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about the relationship between credibility of information and this sort of message that, you know, you check yourself, that if you were a biased media source, you wouldn't tell people to check their emotions. You'd want to, you know, involve people's emotions as much as possible. So thanks for that. That's interesting. Okay, so we don't have too much time left. I want to make sure everybody hears the results. So can you guys just in a brief way talk about what you found? I know it's preliminary for now, but it's fascinating. And you know, my prior when I saw how small this anti-polarization message was, is that it wouldn't have an effect, and you find one. So I think it's really important and exciting. Probably not enough time to talk a lot about how you found it with the whole complicated design you use, but people can always learn about that in other ways.
That's fine. So right after this slide, I inserted some of the results that Jessica, not even you have seen. So one of the things we did, and this is also, I'm showing this in response to a question by Raul on the chat. And so we looked at the comments that people posted on these ads. So think about, you know, we posted an ad that that was corresponded to a particular treatment branch and a particular municipality. And there were many such ads, and then people could comment on them on Facebook. We have all those comments. And so we ran some semantic analysis of this feature called toxicity, which is a probability. And it's interpreted as what this algorithm aims to do is for this probability to tell you how likely is it that somebody reading this comment would find it toxic, bothersome, terrible, and just leave the discussion. Okay, so the bigger the toxicity, so if you look at this histogram, if you move to on the horizontal axis toward the right, that means more toxicity, and toward the left, that means less toxicity. And essentially, the orange part of the histogram is under our anti-polarization prompt, and you can see that there is a lot more mass on the low toxicity part of the distribution. And the mean, which is the dotted vertical line, is also to the left. The green histogram is toxicity under the when there was no anti-polarization message. So this is something that we see as a first stage in technical terms. Did the prompt actually do what we wanted? So we're very encouraged by this evidence. We're looking more deeply on this. Is the last thing we have done in the analysis. The most recent thing, we're looking a lot more deeply into these issues, and into issues also related that have to do with, say, moral attachments or moral styles, particularism versus communalism. Universalism versus communalism. To draw some of the terms that have been used, and we're in the process of seeing whether we have heterogeneous results by those things. So this is so that's our first stage, and then I'm going to skip over this. You can see we have very nice slides. So then what's the let me show you this. This is just one way to present results. On the left, we have a dot plot of the effect. These are effects on the incumbent's vote share. Okay, so on the left panel, what do we see? We see that, and on the horizontal axis, we have the level of COVID cases. So lower means the lowest tercile of cases in your state, the middle tercile, and the upper tercile. So what do we see here? We see an upper slope. We see an upward slope when we don't have the anti-polarization prompt, meaning that the incumbent actually seems to benefit when people learn that his municipality did worse in terms of cases as compared to the rest of the state. These are non-parametric results, so they have large confidence intervals. But in the parametric version, this is statistically significant, even more so when we talk about deaths. So we call this a backlash effect. What is the backlash? This was something we did not expect. We expected people to disregard information that negatively spoke about their incumbents. I personally never expected a backlash of this sort, where you tell them that they're doing worse, and people actually give them a reward. Now, under the anti-polarization treatment, we see the opposite, right? We see an actual reward to incumbents that were doing well. And in the parametric version, we see a punishment also to incumbents that were doing poorly. Okay, so this is the most striking result we have. So the anti-polarization prompt basically reverses the way that people process the information. On the left, it's very reactive. It's basically what one might call one interpretation is this is system one, right? I think fast, I react to what you're telling me. It's an impulse. And on the right, you gave me that prompt and you made me stop on my tracks for a second and maybe be open to information. And now I'm reacting like a citizen and not like a partisan, right? That's one way you could say it. To speak to the mechanism, we see this very interesting thing. So here I showed you that there's an increase in incumbent vote share. We also see an increase in turnout when we do not have the anti-polarization message. whenever we tell people that their municipality is doing poorly. Okay, so this is all consistent with a rally around the in-group effect, which has been documented in social psychology many times, and I think our results are consistent with that kind of a result. So people are incensed, they turn out more. On the other hand, this totally disappears when we have the anti-polarization prompt. Those are our main results. So I want to leave time, Jessica, if you want to say something else, or anybody else in the team wants to add something.
Yeah, this is really exciting. And I know there's been some chat conversation about specific questions. One thing I did want to make sure to hear about from Monica was the point I raised at the beginning of just the challenges of working in doing this sort of research in a polarized setting. So one point Monica had raised that I just hadn't considered before, but I think is important for all of us EGAP members and affiliates to think about, is how the set of researchers and organizations that even can implement work might bias what we're able to learn in a polarized context. So Monica, can you talk about the kind of unequal distribution of ability or access to do this kind of work in your setting?
Yes, of course. I mean, we were talking a little bit more about, I mean, for a starting point in the way like we know each other, no? That's an important thing to say. I mean, we've all known each other from a private university, and we've been in specific areas, no? And usually human rights defending NGOs or NGOs in general are not very privileged in many ways, no? So in terms of the risks they're facing, in terms of the resources they have, in terms of, like there is usually these NGOs are having a lot of work and are not very able to implement or to learn even or to be in touch with the academic world, no? So that's one thing I would like to say. And I think it's also important to understand that the dynamics of many NGOs are very different from the academic world, no? So we do not have, in general, a lot of time to think or to pause or to analyze, no? So I think these type of collaborations are very, very important, and I would like to encourage everyone to try to reach out for NGOs and local implementing partners that can have a different perspective or a complementary perspective, and that can also benefit from learning technical stuff and technical or just in general different methodologies that we are used to implement. We were able to do this because, I mean, we've known each other and we are a quite privileged NGO in the sense that we are not in the front line, no? And we have some resources, but also I would say that it's important to understand the different risks we are facing from NGOs and academia, no? And I think that's also an important thing to bear in mind.
Yeah.
And I think that NGOs would be very benefited from these type of collaborations. So just saying that it is very useful for us to be in these places and to hear out and being able to exchange some of our knowledge is very beneficial for both parties, no? So yeah. I know we have very little time, so.
Yeah, one thing you raised before was that different NGOs face different risks, even security risks. And I think this is even more important as we work in increasingly polarized settings. And EGAP has always paid a lot of attention to the ethics of the work that we do. And maybe this is one of the types of topics we should consider more explicitly as EGAP, to how differential risk might affect our ability to work. in places like this. So I really appreciate your bringing this to all of our attention. We're just about out of time. I tried to take questions from the audience as we went. If you have additional questions, please do use the feature on the comment board. You can then get responses from the research team and the implementers directly that way. And feel free to reach out to us at EGAP if you have suggestions for our future work. Thank you so much to our researchers and practitioner panelists. We learned a lot here today, and I look forward to more of these seminars.
Thank you so much,
Thanks a lot.
Jessica, and all the team at EGAP and everybody else who showed up for this.
And please
thank you for
email
doing
us
this
if you have
important work.
any questions or something that, yeah, we're happy to take comments on or email. Yeah.
Sure. Yes, please feel free to email us directly as well if you wish.
Thank you.
Thank you
Good
very
to
much.
see everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone.